The seaside brew hummed with life on a foggy morning. Inside, the air was thick with the rich scent of roasted coffee beans. Sarah, a 29-year-old waitress, moved gracefully between tables, her warm smile. Her hazel eyes caught the flicker of every patron's mood, a skill honed from years of watching people from the sidelines. The bell above the door chimed, and a man in his early 50s stepped inside his scuffed boots, leaving faint trails on the hardwood floor. Henry, as he would later be known, approached the counter hesitantly, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for rejection. He ordered a black coffee, his voice barely above a whisper, and when Kyle, the young barista with a sharp grin, rang it up, Henry's hands fumbled in his pockets, his face paling as he realized his wallet was missing. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with embarrassment. "I must have left it at home. Can I just sit for a bit, until the fog clears?" Kyle's smirk widened, his arms crossing as he leaned forward. "This isn't a halfway house, buddy. We don't do free rides. If you can't pay, you can't stay." The words cut through the cafe, drawing heads from nearby tables, a couple of tourists in bright raincoats, exchanging amused glances. Henry's cheeks flushed a deep red, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't asking for a handout," he said softly. "Just a place to stay dry." A snicker rose from a corner booth, where a man in a pressed sweater scoffed. "Some nerve walking in here expecting charity," his friend chimed in. "Guess times are tough when you're begging for coffee." The laughter stung sharper than the fog's chill, and Henry turned toward the door, his steps heavy with shame. Sarah, across the room, balancing a tray of empty mugs, felt her chest tighten, her eyes narrowing at the cruelty unfolding. She set the tray down with a quiet clatter and reached into her apron, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill, her tips from the morning shift. Striding to the counter, she placed it firmly beside the register, her voice steady and clear. "I'm covering his coffee, Kyle," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge her. Kyle's smirk faltered. "Sarah, come on, you don't need to play savior for some guy who can't pay his way." She didn't waver, her voice rising just enough to carry. "I'm not saving anyone. I'm doing what's right because I know what it's like to feel invisible." The cafe fell quiet, the earlier mockery replaced by an uneasy hush. A woman at the corner booth muttered how Noble must think he's a secret prince, but Sarah ignored her, turning to Henry with a gentle smile. "Please take a seat. I'll bring your coffee over." Henry's eyes met hers, glistening with something unspoken. Gratitude or relief, or maybe both, and he nodded, finding a chair by the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a quiet witness. As Sarah poured his coffee, she felt the weight of her own past. A memory of her father collapsed on a pier years ago, ignored by passers-by, until a stranger stopped to help, a small act that had anchored her heart ever since. The cafe resumed its hum, but the air felt different now, charged with a subtle shift as patrons avoided her gaze, their coffee cups suddenly more interesting than the scene. They'd mocked. Sarah didn't care about their judgment. She'd spent her life scraping by, splitting rent with her brother Michael, pouring her heart into moments like these because she believed kindness was the one thing she could always afford. Henry sipped his coffee slowly, his hands steadying round the warm mug, and for the first time that morning he felt seen, not as a burden but as a man. Sarah glanced at him from behind the counter, her heart steady with the quiet certainty that she'd done what mattered most. The fog had lifted by the next morning, but a different kind of weight settled over the seaside brew as Sarah tied her apron and began her shift. The glances cast her way felt sharper edged with curiosity or judgment. Yesterday's act of paying for Henry's coffee lingered like a topic no one mentioned directly, yet everyone seemed to carry. Sarah moved through her tasks, but she felt the eyes on her co-workers whispering behind the espresso machine, patrons murmuring over their mugs. By noon the tension broke when Lisa, the manager, a woman with a clipboard always tucked under her arm, called Sarah into the cramped back office. The room smelled of stale coffee grounds and lemon cleaner, a flickering fluorescent bulb casting harsh shadows. Lisa leaned against the desk, her lips pursed. "Close the door, Sarah," she said, her tone clipped. Sarah complied, her fingers brushing the chipped paint on the doorframe as she braced for what was coming. "This is a business, not your personal charity," Lisa began, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to decide who gets free coffee, especially not by embarrassing Kyle in front of customers." Sarah stood still, her hands clasped, her voice calm. "I paid for it with my own money. It wasn't free." Lisa's frown deepened. "That's not the point. You made a scene, disrupted the flow. Customers noticed, and not in a good way." Sarah met her gaze unflinching. "Kyle made the scene. I just ended it." A flash of irritation crossed Lisa's face. "Don't push me, Sarah. You're here to serve tables, not preach about kindness. Do that on your own time." The words stung, but Sarah held her tongue, nodding once before stepping back into the kitchen. There, Marcy, a fellow waitress with a penchant for gossip, leaned against the sink, smirking as she polished a spoon. "Nice stunt yesterday, Sarah. Betting you thought he'd tip you big, huh?" Josh, the dishwasher, chuckled from the corner. "Yeah, probably hoped he was some rich guy playing poor." Sarah ignored them, grabbing a tray and heading back to the floor, her jaw tight but her resolve untouched. She'd heard worse, had lived through worse. The snide comments were just noise. By evening she signed out her apron lighter by the $5 she'd spent, her wallet now holding a single crumpled dollar and a bus pass. She stepped into the cool dusk, the town's streetlights flickering on the ocean's hum, a faint backdrop to her thoughts. Her apartment, a cramped one-bedroom she shared with her younger brother, Michael, was a short walk away, its peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards a familiar comfort. Michael, 19 and thin as a reed, sat on their threadbare couch, wrapped in a blanket, his asthma flaring in the damp coastal air. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sharp, despite his fatigue. "You're quiet today," he said, coughing softly. Sarah sank beside him, brushing a hand over his forehead. "Just a long shift." She hesitated, then told him about Henry, the coffee, the way the cafe turned on him, and how she couldn't let it slide. Michael listened, his expression softening. "You did good, sis, but you know we're tight this month. Your tips are half our rent." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting to the kitchen counter where a stack of medical bills sat unpaid. She pulled out her wallet, staring at the lone dollar and the faded photo of their father tucked beside it, his smile frozen from a time before the hospital visits, before the pier, before everything changed. "I don't regret it," she said, more to herself than Michael. "I'd do it again." He reached for her hand, his voice quiet. "I know you would. That's why I worry." Sarah squeezed his hand back, her heart heavy but certain. She thought of a day when she was 14, her father collapsing on the pier after a long shift at the docks. His breath shallow, the crowd parting around him like he was a broken thing to avoid. A fisherman, older, with hands rough as driftwood, had knelt beside them, offering water and a call to 911, his kindness a lifeline when no one else stopped. That memory had rooted itself in Sarah's bones, a promise she'd made to be that person for someone else. Now, as she reheated leftover soup for Michael, she felt that promise stir again. She didn't care if the cafe whispered or if Lisa's warnings lingered. She'd paid for Henry's coffee because it was right, because she'd seen the shame in his eyes and known it too well herself. Across town, Henry sat in a modest hotel room, his tailored suit folded away, his worn jacket from yesterday draped over a chair. He stared at the coffee mug he'd bought from the cafe, a small memento, its chipped rim, a reminder of Sarah's gesture. He'd spent years traveling, testing people's hearts in diners and cafes, searching for something real amidst a life of wealth that often felt hollow. Sarah's act wasn't grand, but it was singular, a spark in a world that too often looked away. He wondered about her, the waitress, with steady eyes and a voice that didn't waver. What drove her to care when she had so little to give? He didn't know if he'd see her again, but the weight of her kindness pressed against him, a quiet challenge to be more than the billionaire hiding behind a tattered coat. Back at the apartment, Sarah sat by the window, the ocean's distant roar mixing with Michael's soft breathing as he slept. She traced the edge of her wallet, her thoughts drifting not to money, but to the fleeting moment when Henry's eyes met hers, gratitude raw and unspoken. She didn't need thanks, didn't need anything but the certainty that she'd chosen to see someone when no one else would. That was enough. A week had passed since the coffee incident, and Sarah moved through her shifts at the Seaside Brew with quiet determination, the whispers of her co-workers now a dull hum she'd learned to tune out. The coastal town was waking to a rare sunny morning, the ocean sparkling beyond the cafe's windows, its light catching the polished counter where Sarah arranged pastries with care. She felt the rhythm of the place, the clink of mugs, the soft chatter of regulars, but her thoughts kept drifting to Henry, the man whose shame she'd eased with a $5 bill. She wondered where he'd gone, if he'd found a dry place to rest, or if the world had kept pressing its weight on him. The bell above the door chimed, pulling her from her reverie, and she glanced up, her breath catching as a tall figure stepped inside. Henry, but not the Henry she'd met. His tattered jacket was gone, replaced by a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. His salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his polished shoes tapping lightly on the hardwood. He carried an air of quiet authority, yet his eyes held the same vulnerability she'd seen before, a flicker of recognition as he met her gaze. He didn't approach the counter, instead walking to the same window table where he'd sat a week ago, settling into the chair, with a calm that seemed to still the room. Sarah's heart thudded, her hands pausing over a tray of scones as she wrestled with the urge to pretend she hadn't noticed him. She grabbed a menu more out of habit than necessity, and crossed the cafe, her steps deliberate, her voice steady back for another coffee. Henry looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not today, I'm here to ask you something." She set the menu down, her brow furrowing as she sat across from him, the cafe's noise fading into a distant hum. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice low but clear, no trace of accusation, only curiosity. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table as a memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. "When I was 14, my father collapsed on a pier not far from here," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "He was a dock worker, tired, always working. People walked around him like he was nothing but one man. Stopped a fisherman, gave him water, called for help, stayed until the ambulance came." She looked at Henry, her hazel eyes, steady eyes. "Saw that same look in your eyes last week, like you were waiting for the world to walk past you. I couldn't let it happen." Henry leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his gaze never left hers. He took a breath, then spoke. "My name is Henry Caldwell. I founded Caldwell Ventures. We build infrastructure, schools, hospitals in places people forget." Sarah's eyes widened, but she said nothing, her mind racing to reconcile the man in the worn jacket with the one before her. "I wasn't pretending that day," he continued, "but I did leave my wallet behind on purpose. I've been doing it for years. Traveling, visiting cafes like this to see what people do when there's nothing to gain." His voice softened. "In a decade, you're the only one who didn't look away." Sarah's throat tightened, a mix of awe and unease swirling in her chest. "So, I was a test?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Henry shook his head. "Not a test, a search. I lost my sister 15 years ago. She believed in kindness without strings. I stopped believing it existed until you." He paused, his fingers brushing the edge of his coffee mug, though he hadn't ordered one. "I'm hosting a community event tomorrow, a food drive a few miles up the coast. I'd like you to come, not as a guest but as someone who might understand why I do what I do." Sarah studied him, the man who'd been invisible now sitting in plain sight, his wealth a quiet undercurrent to the humility in his eyes. She thought of her own life, the unpaid bills, Michael's cough, the long nights, wondering if she'd ever be more than a waitress in a small town. "I don't know your world," she said finally. "All that money, those projects, it's not me." Henry nodded as if he'd expected her words. "I'm not asking you to fit into my world, I'm asking you to show me yours." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, and she felt something shift, a door cracking open to a possibility she hadn't dared imagine. "I get off at 3 tomorrow," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'll come, but not because of who you are, because of who I saw that day." Henry's smile was small but genuine, a warmth that reached his eyes. "That's enough," he said, rising from the table and leaving the cafe as quietly as he'd entered. Sarah watched him go, the sunlight catching the glass door as it swung shut, her heart caught between skepticism and curiosity. She didn't trust wealth, didn't trust the polished suit, or the name that carried power, but she trusted the look in his eyes, the same look she'd seen when he'd been just a man with no wallet, asking for a moment of grace. As she cleared the table, her fingers brushed the spot where his hands had rested, and she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was walking toward something, not just surviving it. Sarah stood on the edge of a gravel lot the next afternoon, the coastal breeze tugging at her scarf as she watched volunteers unload crates of canned goods at a weathered community center. The sun hung low, casting golden streaks across the ocean, visible just beyond the dunes, and the air carried the sharp scent of salt and pine. She'd taken the bus up the coast, her worn sneakers crunching against the gravel, her heart a mix of anticipation and doubt. Henry had invited her to this food drive, not as a spectator but as someone who might see the world through his lens, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. She spotted him near a stack of boxes, his suit traded for a flannel shirt and jeans, his hands sorting apples with the same care as the other volunteers. He didn't stand out, didn't carry himself like a billionaire funding half the operation, and Sarah felt a flicker of respect for the quiet way he blended in. He caught her eye and waved her over, his smile warm but unassuming. "Glad you came," he said, handing her a crate of bread loaves to sort. Sarah joined the line, her hands moving automatically as she placed rolls into bags, her eyes darting to Henry as he chatted with a local woman about her garden. The woman laughed, her face creasing with ease, and Sarah noticed how Henry listened, not just hearing but absorbing her words like they mattered. The day unfolded in a rhythm of small tasks, unloading trucks, stacking cans, handing out bags to families who arrived in rusted cars or on foot, their gratitude quiet but palpable. Sarah worked alongside Henry, her initial wariness softening as she saw him kneel to tie a child's shoe or pause to ask an elderly man about his day. By dusk, the lot was nearly empty, the last families driving off with bags of groceries, and Sarah sat on a folding chair, her hands dusty, her chest full. Henry joined her, holding 2 bottles of water, one of which he offered her. "You're not what I expected," she said, breaking the silence, her voice soft against the hum of crickets. He raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She shrugged, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Someone who shows up with a checkbook and leaves. I thought you'd be here to be seen." Henry looked toward the horizon, the fading light catching the lines on his face. "I used to be that person," he said. "After my sister died, I thought money could fix everything, but it just built walls. People thanked the checks, not me." He paused, his voice quieter. "I come to places like this to feel human again, to remember what she taught me about showing up." Sarah nodded, her thoughts drifting to her father, his calloused hands, his tired smile. The way he'd always stopped to help a neighbor, even when they had little to spare. "My dad was like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd give his last dollar to someone who needed it more. Taught me that kindness isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to let go." Henry turned to her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment they sat in a silence that felt like understanding. Over the next few weeks, Sarah joined Henry on more trips, not to grand events, but to quiet corners of the world, a library being rebuilt in a forgotten town, a shelter for veterans where he served soup and listened to stories of loss and resilience. They traveled in his old Jeep, its seats worn, the radio crackling with folk tunes, and Sarah found herself laughing more, her shoulders lighter than they'd been in years. In a small diner one evening, over plates of greasy fries, Henry shared more about his sister Clara, who'd spent her life teaching kids in underfunded schools, her laughter a light he still chased. Sarah told him about Michael's asthma, the way she'd stayed in this town to care for him, the dreams she'd tucked away to keep them afloat. "You're not just a waitress," Henry said, his voice firm. "You're someone who changes things just by being you." Sarah looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, a warmth spreading in her chest she hadn't felt since her father's hugs. Back home, she began journaling, her thoughts spilling onto pages in a worn notebook. Moments from the shelter, the library, the way Henry's eyes lit up when a kid hugged him. Michael noticed the change to catching her, smiling as she scribbled. "Late at night, you're different," he said. One evening, his cough softer now, thanks to new medication. "Like you're starting to believe in something again." Sarah hugged him, her heart full but heavy, wondering if she was stepping into a world she could trust. She didn't know Henry's full intentions, didn't know if this was friendship or something deeper, but she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Each trip, each conversation peeled back layers of doubt, revealing a strength she'd always carried, but rarely claimed. As she boarded a bus for another event with Henry, her journal tucked in her bag, she felt the weight of her father's lessons and her own choices merging into something new. A path not paved with wealth, but with purpose, a path she was choosing step by step. The lake stretched out like a sheet of glass under the late summer sky, its edges fringed with tall grasses that swayed in the warm breeze as Sarah sat on a wooden bench outside a rustic cabin in rural Maine. She and Henry had come for a volunteer retreat, a weekend of planning community projects with a small group of organizers, their days filled with discussions about food banks and youth programs, their evenings quiet under the stars. Sarah's sneakers were dusted with dirt from a morning spent planting a community garden, her hand still carrying the earthy scent of soil. Henry sat beside her now, his flannel sleeves rolled up, a thermos of chamomile tea between them, its steam curling into the cooling air. The retreat had been a whirlwind of ideas and laughter, but tonight felt different, heavier, as if the world had slowed to let them breathe together. Henry's voice broke the silence, soft but deliberate. "My sister Clara used to say, kindness is like planting a seed. You don't always see it grow, but you trust it will." Sarah turned to him, her hazel eyes catching the last light of the day, seeing the weight of memory in his expression. He went on, his gaze fixed on the lake. She was my compass, always pointing me toward what mattered. After she died, I lost that direction for a long time. He paused, his fingers brushing the thermos. You remind me of her, Sarah. Not because you're the same, but because you see people the way she did. Sarah's chest tightened, a mix of honor and uncertainty stirring within her. She thought of her own losses, her father's steady presence gone too soon, her mother's quiet strength faded by illness, leaving her and Michael to hold each other up. I don't know if I'm that person, she said, her voice low. I just do what feels right, like paying for your coffee that day. It wasn't about being noble, it was about not letting someone feel small. Henry nodded, his eyes warm with something deeper than gratitude. He reached into his bag, pulling out a simple folder, its edges worn from travel, and handed it to her. I've been thinking about this for a while, he said, as she opened it, revealing documents outlining a foundation in her name. The Sarah Harper Fund, aimed at supporting families like hers, with medical bills, rent, small lifelines to keep them afloat. Sarah's breath caught her fingers, tracing the words as if they might vanish. I don't want this to change you, Henry said quickly, but I want to honor what you've done, not just for me, but for everyone you touch. I'd fund it quietly. You wouldn't have to run it, just know it exists because of you. Sarah closed the folder, her hands trembling, not with fear but with the weight of possibility. She looked at the lake, its surface rippling now as a fish broke through, and felt a surge of clarity. This is incredible, Henry, she said, but I don't want my name on something I haven't built. I want to create something myself, something that feels like that coffee moment, but bigger. She took a breath, her mind racing with an idea that had been growing since their first trip together. What if we opened a community cafe, not just for coffee, but for anyone who needs a meal, a place to sit? No questions asked, no shame, just a door that's always open. Henry's eyes lit up, a slow smile spreading across his face. Tell me more, he said, leaning forward, and for the next hour they talked, Sarah's words tumbling out as she described a space with warm lights, shelves of donated books, a chalkboard with no prices, just a note to pay what you can, or pay it forward. Henry listened, nodding occasionally, his questions sharp but encouraging, and by the time the stars began to speckle the sky, they had a plan. He'd fund the startup anonymously, she'd lead the vision. As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah felt a shift within her, not a leap into his world of wealth, but a step into her own strength. Back home a few days later, she sat with Michael in their cramped apartment, the familiar creak of the floorboards grounding her as she shared the idea. Michael, now stronger, his asthma eased by better medication, grinned. You're building a home for people who don't have one. That's you, sis, always making space. Sarah hugged him, her journal open on the table, its pages filled with sketches of the cafe tables labeled with words like hope and rest. She thought of Henry not as a billionaire, but as the man who'd sat shivering in the cafe, his eyes searching for something real. Their bond wasn't about romance or obligation, it was a quiet resonance to people shaped by loss, finding meaning in showing up for others. Sarah didn't know if the cafe would succeed, but as she looked at Michael's smile, felt the weight of the folder in the bag, she knew she was ready to try. The lake's calm lingered in her mind, a reminder that some choices, like seeds, don't need to be seen to grow, they just need someone brave enough to plant them. The open hearth cafe glowed under the soft September light, its freshly painted walls, the color of warm sand reflecting the coastal town's quiet charm. As Sarah stood across the street, her umbrella catching, the old seaside brew was unrecognizable now, its chipped counters replaced with smooth oak, its flickering lights swapped for hanging bulbs that cast a golden warmth. Volunteers had spent months sanding floors, nailing shelves, hauling donated books, and Sarah had been there for every step, her hands calloused from paint rollers, her heart full from the community that showed up to help. The sign above the door read Open Hearth Cafe in simple cursive, and beneath it a motto etched in glass, a seat for everyone, a story for anyone. Inside, the air hummed with life, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with baking bread, the murmur of voices blending with a soft jazz tune from a donated piano in the corner. Sarah's vision had come to life, not with Henry's wealth alone, but with small donations, local hands, and her own relentless belief that no one should have to earn kindness. She crossed the street, her heart pounding as she pushed open the door, the bell chiming softly. The cafe was alive. A nurse in scrubs sipped tea at a table marked rest. A delivery driver laughed with a barista. A mother and her 2 kids shared a plate of muffins at a table labeled Begin. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, landing on a woman older, Her coat patched her hands, trembling as she hesitated at the counter. "I don't have much," the woman said, her voice low. "Just need a place to sit for a bit." The new barista, a young man named Eli, started to respond, his tone uncertain. "Ma'am, we're a cafe for," but Sarah stepped forward, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "It's okay, Eli," she said, her voice calm but firm, then turned to the woman with a smile. "How about a seat by the window, something warm to drink?" The woman's eyes softened, gratitude flickering as she nodded, and Sarah guided her to a table, the same one where Henry had sat months ago. "First cups on us," Sarah said, handing her a steaming mug of tea. "No questions, no shame." Eli watched wide-eyed, learning in real time, as Sarah moved back to the counter, her presence steadying the room. The soft opening was in full swing. Every seat. Fill the chalkboard by the counter. "Reading your first meal is free, your second, if you can, on someone else." Sarah felt the weight of the moment, her dream, no longer a sketch in her journal, but a living, breathing space. She glanced out the window, her breath catching as she saw Henry across the street, a black umbrella shielding him from the drizzle. His coat collar up, his eyes warm and calm. He didn't wave, didn't step inside, just stood there watching, a quiet pride in his gaze. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Sarah felt a rush of gratitude, not for his money, but for his belief in her, for seeing her when she'd felt invisible. He nodded once, then turned, disappearing into the rain like a promise kept. Later, as the crowd grew, Sarah stepped to the piano, a microphone in one hand, a mug of coffee in the other. The room hushed, the jazz fading as she took a breath, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Years ago, I paid for a man's coffee," she began, her eyes sweeping the faces before her. "I didn't know who he was, didn't need to, I just saw someone being made small, and I couldn't stand by." She paused, her fingers tightening around the mug. "That $5 changed my life, not because it bought something, but because it reminded me who I am, someone who believes kindness doesn't need a reason." A few heads nodded. A man in the back wiped his eyes. "This cafe isn't about coffee," she continued. "It's about showing up, about giving people a place to be seen, not for what they have, but for who they are." Her voice softened, a smile breaking through. "A friend once told me kindness isn't about being remembered, it's about being continued, so that's what we're doing here, one cup, one meal, one moment at a time." The room erupted in applause, soft at first, then swelling the piano, picking up a gentle melody as a saxophone joined in. Sarah set the mug down, her eyes glistening as she watched a barista pour a first cup for a teenager who'd slipped in alone, his backpack worn, his expression uncertain. She thought of Henry, the man who'd sat trembling under the weight of judgment, now a quiet force behind this place, not because he sought credit, but because he'd found something real in her gesture. Their story wasn't about love in the way people might expect. It was deeper, a shared understanding that some connections don't need names or promises, they just need to exist. As the evening wound down, Sarah stood by the window, the rain tapping softly, her reflection steady in the glass. She'd built this not for glory, but for the nurse, the driver, the mother, the stranger who needed a moment of peace. And somewhere out there, Henry carried a piece of this, to a reminder that kindness once given ripples forever. The cafe glowed behind her, a beacon of what happens when one person chooses to see another. And Sarah knew this was only the beginning.